Hi, James.
Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Will Wilkinson of the Cato Institute, and you are James Fowler, a professor of political science?
That's right, at UC San Diego.
At UC San Diego.
Yeah.
And you're one of the authors of a new book called Connected.
Right.
I'm holding it up. The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. And tell us a little bit about your co-author and a little bit about your book, and then we'll plunge in.
Sure. So Nicholas Christakis is my co-author, and he's a professor at Harvard Medical School and also in the Department of Sociology. And our story really is a social network story. Nicholas, his first job was really to explore the widower effect, which is this thing that happens when one person dies in a couple, then it reduces the longevity of another person. And he wanted to know what happens to the next person, to that person's friends, or that person's friends of friends. And so he came to Harvard and gave a talk when I was a graduate student there. And my advisor, who knew I was interested in seeing how political things spread in social networks, heard him give his talk. And he said to me, "You guys are talking about the same thing." And so that was about 7 years ago. We've been doing research together ever since then, and this book is a culmination of some of that research and also lots of really interesting stuff that other people have done that's related to it.
Excellent. So I've seen 3, 4, 5, 6 trade books about networks in the last decade or so. How would you say Connected is different from, Duncan Watts' book or a number of those others that came out a few years ago?
Well, for one thing, we're talking about real-world social networks. And so I think some people, they hear that our book is about social networks and they think Facebook, MySpace, Twitter. But we are really interested in these networks that have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. We've always had friends, we've always had family members, and we've always existed in these complex, beautiful webs of relationships. And we really want to know, these things are so regular and so ubiquitous. How do they form? Why do they have the shape that they have? And what is it that flows across them? And one of the very first things that we looked at whenever we were first studying this great data set we got out of the Framingham Heart Study was the spread of obesity. And so in that study, we actually were able to find that when your friends' gain weight, then it increases the likelihood that you'll gain weight. And so this is just one chapter where we talk about how health effects spread through networks. We also talk about how political factors spread through networks, how money spreads through networks, how emotions spread through networks. And the reason why we do this is because I don't think it's possible to understand MySpace or Twitter or Facebook, those online social networks, until we really get a handle on what's going on in our real-world social networks.
Terrific. You start out. I want to maybe talk a little bit about some things you mentioned at the end of the book first that I find especially interesting, and then move into some of these specific examples that you gave about how things like obesity or voting behavior move through networks. So toward the end, and this is one of the things that I liked a lot about the book was the idea that thinking about networks and the way they affect us offers a kind of third way between a couple of extremes in the social sciences. So on the one hand, you have the sort of extreme atomistic individualism of sort of Homo economicus. On the other extreme, there's kind of radical holism of certain kinds of sociologists or anthropologists. And you're doing something different. You're picturing human beings and their decisions as embedded in a network of people and a network of social influences. But it's kind of neither of those other things. Could you elaborate a little bit on what's unique about doing social science from the perspective of networks?
Sure. So, the last few centuries in social science have been sort of like a tennis match, where we've been going back and forth between the individual and the group. And so you have this great work done in the 18th century where we first started to really study decision making. And you had great mathematicians, and you had some of the first great social scientists like Adam Smith trying to think about individual decisions and individual incentives. And there was a real reaction to that in the next century by scholars like Durkheim and Marx, who thought that, no, you're missing it. There's actually this thing that's going on that's larger than individuals in these groups. But the problem with that research was that they got so obsessed with groups that they started to think that individuals were the groups, right? You no longer had, individual consciousness. You had group consciousness. You did whatever the proletariat told you to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we had a reaction to that in the 20th century, and we started developing some neat methodological tools. And so statistics came along. We started doing a lot of empirics. And one of the fundamental assumptions of the ordinary least squares regression model is that the observations have to be independent. We also had this really great innovation in terms of game theory and the rise of microeconomics. And again, what do you have to assume? You have to assume that preferences are independent. Now, those assumptions are great. We made a lot of progress in the 20th century making those assumptions, those Robinson Crusoe assumptions, to understand how people behave in a vacuum. But as it turns out, those assumptions often drive the science. And it's driven us off a cliff, really, because we got to a point where we couldn't understand some complex phenomena. These are complex phenomena that we've only recently started to understand in terms of the relationships between people. And so sociologists have been studying social networks for, a very long time, for the last 40 years. But physicists kind of came on the scene in the late 20th century. Duncan Watts, Laszlo Barabasi, Stephen Strogatz. These guys really applied some elegant, beautiful mathematics to these networks and made the whole scientific community realize that to understand complexity, you needed to move beyond the individual, but not all the way up to the group. You needed to focus on the relationships between groups and how those relationships structure interactions and how they cause things to flow from one node to another in the network. And for human beings, what that means is that what we should be thinking about is these social contagions. Things like political behavior, things like emotions, things like love and sex and your health behavior.
Terrific. Well, I find this is a great perspective myself. It's really illuminating. I mean, we all, I think, grasp that, and I think it's become, more and more, unavoidable and broadly acknowledged that individuals are, richly socialized and that we are a social species. But the thing that I see as really adding to just the idea that, we live in groups is that our sociality has a structure, that we are related to one another in distinct ways, and there are regularities in those kinds of relationships, and the structure of our relationships makes a difference that we might not notice or sort of be conscious of the influence that the structure of our relationships is having on our lives, but the influence is there. I was wondering if I could get you to, because I thought it was helpful as a starter in the book, you lay out right at the beginning a few sort of rules about social networks that help us sort of understand them and our relationship to it. I don't mean to give you a pop quiz on your own book. So I understand it. But I think you have had sort of 5 rules about the way about our relationship to networks, and I wondered if we could just walk through those real quickly.
Sure. So 2 of these rules are related to the shape of networks, and 3 of them are related to what flows across them. So the first 2 are pretty obvious. We shape our networks. And so the very first thing that you have to realize whenever you're studying anything about networks is that they're not fixed. They're not given to us. These networks evolve as a result of us choosing to be friends with someone, choosing to work in a certain location, choosing to live in a certain neighborhood next to neighbors, choosing to marry the perfect person. And so it's these choices that aggregate to create these complex patterns that yield this behavior that's really fascinating. The second rule is that those networks then shape us. And so, one of the examples that we give for how the structure of the network actually matters is some great work